types of issues that would be addressed as part of a potential overlay district. We've really broken it down into 4 categories for discussion tonight. Massing and form, which really gets at how big and bulky is a new development, a new home compared to what's there. Design and character, housing options, and then we'll talk specifically about incentives last. And that's really in that how we build the incentives is really going to depend on some different factors. So we're going to give you a feel of what the standards might look like, and then we'll talk about, well, how might we vary those based on what the preferences are. All right. So I'm going to walk through each of those 4 areas. We're going to talk a little bit about what we've heard from you, walk through some of the potential strategies, and then we're actually going to flip this. We're going to talk about questions and concerns first, and then we're going to ask for your general feedback on, are we headed in the right direction with this particular issue? So try to break it down into bite-sized pieces here. If my clicker will cooperate. So first off, massing and form. I think what we heard from you back in July is, there's definitely a preference for traditional building forms. And I think, depending on who answers the question, some people were, maybe very, very sure they wanted something to be on this end of the spectrum, and others said, I'm okay with some additional flexibility. But, we definitely heard that as a theme. I think we definitely heard a common theme that folks didn't want, and these were your words, not ours, but monster homes in terms of height, overall mass and scale, and particularly the really blocky building forms. We heard folks say, I don't mind contemporary design, but I don't want to see, a big box with a rooftop deck, that we're seeing in other communities. And then we also heard a need for consideration in terms of, let's be thoughtful about who's next door when we've got a project, whether it's an individual home or, a larger project, and you've got that transition, that needs to be something that would be addressed so you don't have a really abrupt change right next to each other. Sorry, I'm going to try something else here. So the first one, all right. All right, so the first potential standard to get at this issue of massing and form is something that's called a bulk plane, and this basically addresses the envelope in which the building can be built. And so in the top example, you see under your current regulations, you've got a height limit, but you've got setbacks. But the mass of the building can be significantly larger. And so if you were to look at potentially putting into place a bulk plane, so coming up from your setbacks and then creating that building envelope, you can reduce the scale and the mass of the building overall. So that's something that would primarily apply in the case of single-family homes, additions, those types of things. It really doesn't work when you get into townhomes or small-scale multifamily. So the next thing that we could look at is addressing the side walls. And so this really comes into play in that single family context where if someone comes in, again, builds to the setback and they have twice as much lot coverage as you could end up with a sheer wall along the length of your yard that goes up 2 stories or so along that. And so you can start to look at what types of adjustments might be appropriate to break up that mass along the sidewall. And you can also look at this issue of traditional building forms. And so that can be very loose and it can be very prescriptive. And as I noted, I think what we heard is we want to address the basic form of development. So we prefer pitched roofs generally. It doesn't mean we can't have any flat roofs, but we want to convey that those traditional building forms are preferable to big boxy building forms. And this is basically just showing how that would apply to multifamily versus single family. The other issue that we can get at through potential standards is looking at your lot coverage requirements. And so the map on the left illustrates the range of lot sizes that exist in Original Town today. So the traditional building lot is about 6,000 square feet, and you can see those smaller ones. Those are the so the lightest color ones, kind of the buff color ones. They're along William and Coal Creek. Thank you. So basically, what we're trying to get at with the map analysis is that right now you have a one-size-fits-all lot coverage requirement. So you could apply 40% lot coverage to a lot that was 6,000 square feet, or you could apply it to a lot that was much larger than that. And so I think that's potential flag in terms of, is that consistent with what the community wants to see? So if someone came in and wanted to build a house that had 3,000 square foot footprint, just because they had that 40%, is that consistent with what we're trying to do? So one option is to develop more of a sliding scale. So do a little bit more analysis on the range of lot sizes that you have, and tailor that to so that you get a little bit more depending on how your lot sizes shake out. So just to give you an example of what that might look like, you would start with your smallest lot. You would probably, maybe you have 40% lot coverage, and then as the lots get bigger, the allowances drop. And so it's just a way to sort of recognize that, it's not really a one-size-fits-all, and there needs to be some consideration for that. So, and these, metrics are not set in stone. I think it's just really meant to give you a sense of how that might work. All right, so those are kind of the things that we're looking at in terms of massing and form. What questions do you have, concerns about those before we get a feel for where everyone's in? Any questions?
Can you go back to that maximum lot slide? Mm-hmm. I didn't understand the illustration where it says existing median lot coverage in RL portion of Original Town is 25%. What's the one below?
Sure. So yeah, no, thanks for bringing that up. So the top one is basically Sung had done an analysis of, based on the buildings that are out there today, what is the typical lot coverage? And so that's where the 25% comes in the RL is what's typical today. And part of that is being swayed a little bit by the modest size of your original homes. A lot of those are, less than 1,000 square feet. Some are less than 800 square feet. So you're tending smaller to begin with, but the recognition is that basically what's allowed today in your existing zoning is up to 40%, and that's a big difference, and that it's not tied to lot size at all. So.
Well, and then the other question I have, so I'm not great at math, but that 40% lot coverage, I don't see how that's only 40%. It looks to me like you could multiply that by 2 and fit it on that lot twice. So how is that 40% lot coverage? I don't understand how that.
So we build those models in a 3D modeling program. We're able to calculate area, so it's 40% based on the analysis of the footprint as well as the lot size. So it is a little hard to wrap your head around, I agree, but that's kind of one way that could shake out. The other thing that you would see, this particular example has an attached garage, so you might see a detached garage. So there's a lot of different ways you can move it around on the lot, but that is an example of what 40% looks like. So.
Do we know what our neighboring communities lot coverage is?
It varies. Typical.
Questions from the audience?
So the question was, do we know what's typical for neighboring communities in terms of lot coverage? And it really just depends. But anywhere from 35 to 40, some are lower. If it's in a historic district, so it just depends. And sometimes some communities have gone through similar conversations and kind of adjusted those. But you're within the range. You're just on the higher end of the range currently. So.
And then how do you reconcile, a one-story versus a two-story? You can have 40% lot coverage on a single story that's not intrusive at all, and then you make it a two-story and it's very intrusive, right? So how do you...
Great question. And that's something we'll talk about when we get to the incentives, is, how you can kind of do a little give and take there potentially to get at that. But you're absolutely right. There's nothing in there that says, well, if you do 40%, it has to be one story, because you're getting a lot more. You could go in and you could do 2 stories at 40%, and that's what's in your code currently. So, other questions about any of the specifics? Yeah.
I just had one thought relative to that, though. The bulk plane that you were mentioning sometimes can, depending on how it's set up, can limit that second-story development to a smaller scale, right? If you're cutting off those edges and you can't go straight up for 2 stories, sometimes you can help.
Absolutely. And so just so everybody understands, too, where this conversation would go, I think what we're trying to do tonight is get a sense of, are there any of these ideas that you're not comfortable with, or, things that we haven't talked about that you want to see addressed. But what we would ultimately need to do is put all those things together. And so if you applied those standards together, you build in your incentives, there's some calibration that would need to happen. And so there would be another conversation to say, as we apply all of these things, this is kind of what the ultimate result is. This is the size of the home that could be built. There's another level of conversation that would need to happen to say, did we get it right? And so this is sort of a next step in that direction in terms of just the ideas. So, other questions? Yeah.
So, I'm following here, SF being single family. What are you saying to yourself when you're saying RL? What words are you saying for RL, and what words are you saying for RL?
So RL stands for residential low, right? So I'm looking at, and residential medium, I think, is the RM. So the main distinction is just that you start to introduce some of those attached housing products in your RM district. So duplexes and townhomes.
I might be a little behind on this, but are we talking about any zoning changes to limit multifamily? We're not talking about any zoning changes.
What we're talking about is potential adjustments to the standards within the districts, but there has been no discussion of changes to uses. So, other questions? Okay. Well, so we have one question on each of these just to kind of get a general feel here.
I'm sorry, but you have to re-educate me, not to use whatever this 21st century device is.
So, all right. Our next question, it works just like your remote control.
I don't have remote control.
So it's got numbers on it. So the numbers correspond to the numbers up here. So we want to know first how well these initial ideas related to massing and form, how well do these kind of fit with where you think the conversation should be going? Very well, well, I'm still on the fence, not well at all, you're not sure. All right, going once. Okay, so we're headed in the right direction. It looks like obviously there's more conversation to be had, but so also moving into design and character. And so what we heard is this idea of protecting and maintaining this eclectic character. And I think so what that means to me is we don't want to prescribe a specific architectural style. We're not asking everyone to build a Victorian home. We're not asking everyone to build a craftsman home. You know, we want to be flexible, and we want to just focus on kind of the shape of the building, how it relates to other things. But we also want to make sure that we're not getting and this is also your term, cookie cutter design. You know, when there's more than one home being built, we don't want them all to look the same. You know, part of what gives Original Town character is that there is some variety, and you all expressed a desire to really protect that diversity. I mentioned the flexibility for existing homes, you know, whether that applies to someone wanting to build an addition, you know, whether there is a new ADU allowance or accessory dwelling unit allowance, redevelopment. We talked about the idea of, you know, some of your original homes in Original Town are non-conforming in terms of their setbacks. So if you wanted to put a front porch on your house, you actually couldn't do it without going through and asking for an exception to that. And so there's a lot of things that we can look at to help provide that flexibility. We also heard, although there were different opinions on this, but I think a general preference for alley-loaded homes in terms of you have an established pattern of alleys in Original Town, and the sense is that, you know, having the garages not be on the front of the house was a characteristic that the community wanted to encourage as much as possible. So when we start looking at the types of approaches you might take to this. So this is an example, current regulations. This is one of the first examples that Sung had put together for us earlier in the summer. You know, you could have a row of front-loaded garages that, you know, dominates the streetscape. It's going to be very different than what you have today. That's possible. And so as you start looking at what some potential standards might do, if you are moving the garages to the back, making sure that you don't have the identical home on the street, there's a lot of different ways that you can get at this. But I think the point is, if you do more than one home, or for two or more homes, you would need to provide some variation. And we would go through, we'd develop a menu of options in terms of how you could achieve that variety. And that's something that, you know, we would have more conversations about in terms of, you know, what are the things that are important to encourage people to do through that menu of options. So as you get into small-scale multifamily, so this is just an example of a duplex or a fourplex, you know, same premise applies. You know, either you have the front-loaded garages or you take advantage of the alleys and you've got more opportunity for variation on that street frontage. The more homes you get on a particular site, obviously the bigger impact it has. And so, you know, that's a case where it's pretty typical for communities, particularly on the Front Range, to have standards that address this issue of you can't just build the same home 10 times. That's just not something that most communities are accepting of. And so, you know, again, a lot of different ways that you could come at this, but the point is, you know, we heard you didn't want to see that repetition along a block frontage. All right, so design and character, pretty short list of things. What do you guys think? Are there other things that we should be talking about? Do you have concerns about any of these? Yeah.
Well, I may not be up to speed, but we're talking about Northwest Superior. Where exactly are these homes going to be built?
So we did an analysis early on. We actually have, I can pull up a map for you later. I don't have it in the presentation, but we did an analysis of vacant lots in Northwest Superior. So you do have some larger parcels that are vacant. You have some individual lots that are vacant, but you're also potentially, you could get this through redevelopment. So if someone came in and, you know, purchased a home or multiple homes and said, you know, I want to build a bigger home on those lots, they could tear it down, redevelop it, and build a new home. And so it's
these vacant lots in Superior or the outside of Superior?
No, they're in Northwest Superior.
Because if you drive along 76th Street, I'm just trying to think where you would be talking about.
Yeah, we've got a map I'm happy to share with you, but we looked at that, and it's going to be incremental. I think you're not going to see likely kind of radical changes in a short period of time, but we wanted to help people understand is that you do have that potential for change, and that it's important to understand that that possibility exists. And so even though it feels like an area that's relatively built out, you're still going to see some development, and probably pretty soon in some cases. So.
Well, I know that the Costco and the Target, and the stores in the Superior Marketplace are on the east side of 76. Sagamore's on the west side. So I'm still confused as to where you'd be talking about.
So we're still talking about Original Town, and so we did the analysis of the lots in Original Town, and
Talking about Northwest.
sorry, we kind of zoomed in a little bit here. So we're talking about Northwest Superior, Original Town specifically. So it's that, yeah, and we do have a map. We're happy to share it with you. So, other questions, concerns on this particular set? Okay. All right, similar question, just related to design and character. Are we on the right track? Other concerns? Going once. Okay. All right. Even more strongly on the well, it looks like on this side. Okay. All right, so let's talk about housing options. I mentioned earlier, we definitely heard through the workshop conversations in July that, people appreciate the variety of housing options that are available in Northwest Superior. And what we mean by that is not just, whether it's a single family home or a multifamily home, but, we like the variety of sizes, we like the variety of price points that, this is, providing an option for folks that may not exist in other parts of Superior. And so that's a characteristic that you want to encourage the retention of over time. We also heard a lot of interest in looking at allowances for accessory dwelling units, recognizing that there needed to be some parameters surrounding that. And so we have some additional detail we can talk through on that. But the idea there is that there were two things. I think it was acknowledged that there are some non-conforming ADUs that already exist in Original Town. This would be one mechanism to sort of encourage people to bring them into compliance. But it would also give folks who do have a small home on a large lot, other options. Do they want to build a accessory dwelling to house an aging parent or, a teenager that won't move out of the house? There's a lot of different things that, that could come into play, but we definitely heard interest in that. So talking about housing options generally first, I think right now, even though the RM district does allow for a mix of housing types, duplex, townhome, single family, there's nothing in there that would compel someone to do that if they weren't necessarily of that mindset. And so, you could end up with a fairly large, pocket of just single family homes. For some people, that's perfectly fine. I think one option is to look at, requiring a certain mix of housing types with some flexibility for projects of a certain size. So obviously, this isn't going to kick in if you have, two lots in right in the middle of Original Town. But for larger projects, that is an option that could be considered to kind of continue that mix of housing types. So getting into the accessory dwelling units, So there's different ways that they can be built. The most typical one that most people are familiar with is above the garage. You'll see that in other communities, but there are situations where it can be built, next to a garage, or you can also have a separate unit in a primary dwelling. This is actually something we're now seeing some of the major home builders do. They're building in kind of a mother-in-law suite into, typical single-family home. So it's a defined size, but kind of has a shut-off, separate entrance, that sort of thing. But it is different than a duplex. So the main difference is, this is within the main home. There's a size limit. It's a pretty different scenario than a duplex. So even though there's technically 2 dwelling units, shouldn't be confused as being the same thing. So just a little bit of context about different ways that could go forward. So what's represented here are some of the typical approaches. We had done some research a few years ago from all of the Front Range communities to try to get a sense of, what are the standards that are in place for accessory dwelling units? How many have been built? What are people seeing? What are some of the barriers? So we did a bunch of research on that. And these are just some of the key takeaways from that in terms of, what's most common as you look at other communities in this area. So in terms of size, 500 to 800 is pretty typical, and that's kind of a kind of typical apartment size, but there were some examples where they went up to 1,000 square feet, and so there's a range there, and that's one of those questions that we would really need to look at in terms of, as Lisa mentioned, how does that relate to overall lot coverage and some of the other principles that we're talking about in terms of what that size range is, and so lots of different ways to look at that. Height and setbacks, most typically that's going to be the same as for your primary dwelling. And Stephen, correct me if I'm wrong, but the current height limit for garages, for example, it's like 32 feet. So that's what you'd be starting with, is that same height. ADUs are required to have their own parking, and in addition to the parking for the primary structure, oftentimes there are requirements to say, it needs to at least relate to the primary dwelling unit in terms of its character. Utilities are most frequently on the same meter as the primary residence, and that's one way to sort of help incentivize that, is that you don't have that separate fee to kind of build that unit. And then communities vary pretty significantly in terms of, how they handle occupancy of those units. I know one of the concerns that came up, folks always raise the question of how do we know it's not going to turn into a rental that's, has bad tenants, and, there's a lot of different potential concerns that come up. And most communities handle that, through their code enforcement process. It's typically complaint-based, so there's no way, feasible way for a community, whether you're the size of Superior or the size of Boulder, to, feasibly go out and check every single unit. So it's important to understand that that's, you can have those rules in place, but it's really going to be up to the community to kind of help keep an eye on what's happening and make sure that if folks are breaking the rules, that they, those issues are reported. But those are kind of some of the basic considerations that could be built into that discussion. The other thing that I think that's worth noting in that the prior research that we had done, I think there's a concern that often comes up in these conversations of, well, if we allow ADUs, we're essentially doubling our density in this existing area. And in reality, what's happened in most of the metro area communities is a very modest number of permits that have been issued for ADUs. So it hasn't really caught on, in a wildfire type way, as you might think, in terms of the number of units. At least as of a couple years ago, there was no community that had permitted more than 15 units in a given year. So it's, obviously we're talking about 150 lots here versus several $100,000 in some cases. But, I think that's just something to keep in mind, that it's an option, but it doesn't mean everyone's going to kind of go down that path at the same time. All right, so the other issue we touched on in terms of the overall Northwest Superior concerns and related to Original Town was this issue of connectivity. And so block layout is what we kind of think about in terms of when we went out on our walk in Original Town, it's a very walkable area. The blocks are smaller, you've got the alleys, that's part of what gives it the flavor. And so one of your existing policies in your comprehensive plan actually talks about the desire to carry forward that grid pattern to larger projects, and so wanting to protect that. But on the flip side, there are concerns about if we have direct connections, are we going to have more traffic? And so this is one of those ongoing conversations that you've had as a community, and we bring it forward here just to kind of reinforce that you do have a policy in place, and that the more clarity you can provide on this issue, I think the better, the more predictability you have as a community, as residents, as well as for folks who may bring forward potential projects. And so, should that be something that gets addressed through subsequent steps in the process. So, housing options, questions, concerns, ADUs, any of those issues?
So do things like VRBO and Airbnb and that sort of thing fall under ADUs?
Great question. So we did not call that out specifically. Typically, that's being handled through a separate ordinance that communities are adopting, to kind of, make a case on that. Stephen, have you guys had that conversation at all?
We don't have an allowance for VRBOs. Right now, we don't have a code that necessarily prohibits them either. I think it's just silent on it. So I think that Rock Creek probably has its own covenants that protect against that, is my understanding. But typically, how VRBOs are distinguished against like a rental is just a term of lease. So if we have a provision in place to allow for an accessory dwelling unit, that the term of lease has to be at least a month or 6 months or something like that in order to, if that's a concern. If it's not a concern, and that's something that folks want, then that's what we need to hear too.
Hasn't been brought up. Other thoughts on that?
I was going to ask, well, personally, I'm kind of in favor of it. We addressed the VRBO. I think it should be left up to the homeowner. But my question was more related to the unit itself. Do these units have a full kitchen, or are they just basically a hot plate? What are we looking at?
So we hadn't gotten to that level of specificity, and I think I'd be curious to hear, there's different approaches to that. Some communities allow a full kitchen. That makes it a more self-sustaining unit. I think based on the conversations we had, that was kind of my interpretation of what I was hearing, but I'd love to hear whether that's right or wrong or other thoughts on that. Anyone else? Yeah.
Well, it's interesting. So we are interested personally in putting in a mother-in-law unit in our garden level basement and making it a separate little apartment with an entrance, but also get into the house. And the kitchen thing came up, and I actually thought that if you limited it to like a kitchenette and a hot plate, I think it would be a lot more likely then that people would want to, well, I would personally rent it out to like an Airbnb or a VRBO, because what's the long-term, who's going to live there long-term with a hot plate? I mean, I don't know, maybe people do. but if you make it so it's a full sustaining unit, then it actually could be so you could have family live there or have longer-term rentals. So that's just my 2 cents.
Other thoughts on that? And that's a pretty different, it's kind of 2 separate issues. I mean, but I think it's an important one to bring up, so I'm glad you, yeah.
And just going along with that thought there on the full kitchen, it's not sustainable. I've looked at this considerably. Nobody lives for a long time. If you're taking care of a parent, or you have a student in the university, and they're going to be in there for 4 or 5 years, maybe they're going to even do their PhD, and they're going to be there for 8 or 9 years. Everybody is going to want to have, if you want to
separate, you want it separate as much as you can outside of wanting to be together. So without a full kitchen, it's really not sustainable.
So at least having the option to do that if you wanted to.
Well, and I don't know how you regulate it. It's not regulated now. I mean, it would be impossible to have the town actually walk around and decide whether there was a kitchen or not, or whether a kitchen got put in after the fact. I mean, it just seems untenable in that sense.
So if someone's building a new unit, and Stephen, basically they're going to have to get a building permit. They're going to have to get that. So what would the process be for that now?
For now, it would be limited by the building permit. So the building permit wouldn't allow you to have a full bath, a full kitchen in a separate unit. But I think Daryl's point is, whether or not somebody gets a building permit, and that's up to regulate.
Yeah.
Actually, I think we'd be in a better spot to regulate with an allowance for it, because then people would actually approach us and talk to us about what the regulations are, and then we would need to code in order to allow for whether or not it's a kitchenette or a full kitchen. So.
And the other thing to consider is if someone's going to go through the process of building, a unit above their garage, or even, it's next to their garage, that's a significant investment. Most people are going to need to take out a loan for that, whether it's part of their mortgage, that sort of thing. They're going to need a permit in order to get that loan approval. So hopefully that's part of that, moving them in that right direction. So, but you're always going to have folks who choose to go the back way. So.
Right, so I'm just thinking of, you might as well just go the whole, go for it, instead of having these things.
You mean to just allow the full kitchen?
Just allow it,
sure.
so that then you're not,
having to micromanage that.
Or it just happens, and then, you've got a VRBO next to you, and it's not supposed to be there, but yet how do you actually, there's just
makes
no way
sense.
to regulate it.
Yeah.
Even if you have it in the code, there's no way to regulate it. No more than 3 person per house is hard to regulate, even though it's on the books.
Yeah.
So I guess my feeling is just go for it.
Any other thoughts? Yeah.
It does seem, though, that the limitation on the square footage can address that, because if it's a 500 square foot place, you're not going to get 8 people living there. And even if you have the full bathroom and a little tiny kitchenette, it's made for somebody, a single or
a couple or something.
Mm-hmm. So I don't think that is. Yeah.
So just in case everybody didn't hear that, so the point was that, size of the unit may help get at the occupancy issues. So if it's a 500 square foot unit with 1 bathroom, hopefully that's sort of, a de facto limitation in terms of how many people are willing to cram into that size of a unit. So important part of the conversation. So I think I
was going to say one positive side of having short-term rentals is that if they're crummy neighbors, at least know they're going to be gone soon.
That's my husband,
A day or 2 versus.
Just a comment, for making the allowance, it does help a lot. If people know that they can get it permitted, it keeps them from doing really stupid things where they end up with a fire, they end up with a death, or they end up with something that none of us want. And they don't want it either. They're just not smart enough to not have it happen. But if it's in there and they know that they can have it, they just have to jump through just a couple of extra hoops to be legit. Most of them will do it.
Yeah, it's also going to help with your resale in terms of just having the proof of you went through the right channels. So not everyone's going to do it, but I think it should help if that were the case. So any other thoughts on,
I had a question about the parking, because it was 1 space. And is that space on their property, or is that street space, or is that across the neighbors?
On the property. And so, that's... so, typically, that's going to be, that's in addition to the spaces that you need to have for the primary unit. It needs to be off-street. If you were right next to a light rail station, that might be different. But I think in a neighborhood, the situation is typically it's going to be off-street. Yeah. And so that's, that's another area area where, the lot coverage and all of those things are going to come into play, does that have to be a paved off-street parking place, or can it be, a gravel driveway, or, those types of things? Those are all details that you need to kind of spell out. So.
And it's a part of the coverage.
Yeah, if it were paved, it would be part of your coverage, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I wanted to ask about the grid layout and concerns about traffic and coming through. And we live right here at Colvin First, so we see people come by. And I was curious if there's been any consideration about like the Goss Grove neighborhood layout in Boulder, and how it really just has two things, and it still maintains its walkability, but traffic can't come barreling through because it's a nightmare. It's great. Nobody wants to drive down it. If anyone's considered that as like a median in between the two.
So I'm not familiar with the specific, I think I can picture what you're talking about, but they've got kind of center, so it causes people to kind of...
Yeah, so the streets, it's still a grid, but then like one street goes this way and the other, and you can't actually drive through, but there's a sidewalk there, and you can bike through, and it's really lovely. But the traffic, there's just, you can't drive more than a block or two without having to then turn into a different direction, and it's pretty effective.
So kind of a modified grid with, make it tricky.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So it might be something to consider.
Yeah.
And one other thing, have we addressed at all work-live options where somebody has their residence, and then in the front they have a permanent office, whether they're an attorney or an accountant, or they have a small store, or they have whatever, maybe not retail, but something where we have a mixed use on a single lot, somebody can work and legitimately license their business there as well.
So that specific issue has not come up. It was not, would not be allowed in your current zoning.
We have a whole occupation allowance, which allows for some of it, but not, I think you're describing more of a traditional, split, a building that has, separate areas for us to use, like
with
a downstairs office and then upstairs. And the big thing with that is just the traffic impacts in terms of whether or not, what that use is and whether or not it's bringing in, 10 trips a day or 2 or 75. So.
We actually have a zoning. We actually have a zoning for RCS. It's not. No. We have that RCS zoning.
Oh.
We don't have it anywhere, but it exists in our code. It came up a decade or so ago, residential character street zoning, which allows for the idea of an attorney or a doctor's office on the property, but the discussions were the entire street or block or something would have to come forward and say we'd like to do that, because it just creates a significant change to the block if it would be done. But the zoning is written. We have it. It's just a matter of where, if we change any, that would be a zoning change like you mentioned earlier.
The idea has come up in the context of the marketplace, though, as as that area evolves, that having more live-work options, kind of the true building, might work there in with those other uses, so that where the impacts are also a little bit less. So, yeah.
I had a question on slide you put up earlier that I didn't understand, where it was single houses here and the other was single plus forced or regulated, a requirement that they had mixed house. So can you explain that a little bit more? Say that long brown lot is empty and someone wants to put a single house.
Sure. No, and so typically that type of standard would kick in when you're looking at a much larger project. And so, it's less about a specific location, but just saying if you have 50 acres and you're allowed to build X number of homes, we'd like to see a mix of different types of homes. You can decide where to put those unless there are other standards that say, you need to concentrate your highest density in this location and transition to the single family neighborhood in this location. So there could be some other locational criteria, but basically it would be up to the developer to say, I think, here's a mix that fits what you're asking for, and this is how I think it works best in terms of, the types of units that I'm offering in my project. Does that make sense?
It does. I was just thinking about the 6 lots lots or whatever down, Suzanne, by your house, whether they, whoever buys those, that they'd say, okay, well, one of them has to be.
Yeah, in this case, that's a great example because that's a case where that's too fine-grained. That's not practical. And so I think this is really meant to get at, bigger sites where someone feasibly can do, a range of options. And so it would kick in much larger cases. The townhome example you're giving, you would strive to get that mix of, what they look like, but they would all still be townhomes, if that makes sense.
Just a comment. One thing we're also going to be talking about is that development at the corner of 4th and Williams, the townhomes. It's a very small multifamily lot, right? There's this opportunity in town that could result in small lots that are multifamily being able to come in and build townhomes. That developer came forward. They had a proposal that didn't meet our code. It would have required a code change for them to do what they wanted to do. And if we had wanted that, potentially better looking or better fitting multifamily development in this small area, we just didn't have the opportunity to do it. I'd like personally, and I don't know about the rest of the commission, but I'm looking at that going, if we're going to have these small areas pop up and be multifamily, what can we do to work with the developer to put what's most effective and works best in that area and not be quite restricted to our code, which is really more designed for larger developments and multifamily developments, not for this, 1 acre lot and putting some townhomes on it.
All right. So, any other questions on housing options before we move forward? Okay. So same question, just want to get a sense of if we're on the right track. A lot of good questions you guys raised that we can add to the discussion. Going once. Okay. So we got more people on the fence here in this one, but I think generally looks like we're still headed down the right direction. So before we move on, just while we've got everybody and it's fresh, is there anyone who said I'm still on the fence that wants to share what their particular hesitations are? Or I won't call on anyone, you don't have to, but okay. Just wanted to ask. So now that we've talked about some of the different types of standards that we could look at, we wanted to address this issue of flexibility and how do we build that into the overlay. And I think one of the things that you often get into is this predictability and flexibility and what's the right result. And I think what you guys told us was the guidelines probably aren't going to get us there. I remember one person specifically saying, we're not going to be happy with that result because we're basically saying, we'd like you to do this, but you can do whatever you can still do what you want. And so having that balance was really important. So as we think about how that might play out, the typical things that you can use for incentives are those metrics in your code. And so when we talk about lot coverage, that's a specific percentage that you can vary up or down to try to, apply with different types of incentives. You can use height as one of those tools. You can use setbacks. So anything that sort of has a number attached to it is a good candidate for looking at potential incentives. So the example on the right kind of takes into account what Bob raised earlier of, 40% of a single family home or a single story home is a lot less impactful than 40% of a two-story home. And so if you take that idea and you play that out, you could say, well, we'd really like to encourage more single-story homes, and we're willing to give them more lot coverage if they build a smaller scale home. It can still be a substantial square footage, but that's something we'd like to see. So that's just an example. So if you play that out, you could say that your lot coverage could increase if you started at, you reduced your baseline to 30%. Then people can kind of earn back that additional lot coverage by doing different things. So in this example, one of the objectives was, we'd like to see the original housing stock retained. So if you choose to add on to an existing home versus build a new one, we'll give you a little bit more lot coverage. And so there's a lot of different ways you could come at that. And you build that addition behind the home instead of popping the top and going up. You're going to get even more lot coverage. And so you have the ability to sort of pick and choose how you might earn that back. And so that's just one example. It could, the same type of thing could be factored in for, as I said, height or setbacks, but it's really important to have a conversation now of what are you guys willing to, kind of look at in terms of what those trade-offs might be. And my point with that is that, if we hear from you that height is, we absolutely want to maintain that 32-foot height limit we have currently. We shouldn't be looking at incentives that look at reducing that height. So it would really help us to understand, what are you willing to kind of give a little to maybe get some of the other types of things that you're looking for. So the question I'm going to ask you kind of specifically relates to, are you comfortable with all of these, some of these, and we can kind of talk about that. But are there questions generally about incentives and how that might work before we kind of do the polling? Yeah.
Just one concern. The fact of the matter is people have a lot of stuff. And that's probably never going to go away. That's why we have storage units and everything else. Because we don't have basements in original town, because the water table is too high, and people use basements for stuff, if we want to slow growth, if we want to maintain things, that's fine. It's just as people come in or developers come in and things develop, we have to think about how are people going to live in these dwellings? And if we limit the height and say spread it out and make it single story, they don't have a basement to go with that either. Mm-hmm. So there's some limits. That's it. Just a note. Yep. Not necessarily a preference.
It's a good observation. Other thoughts on that? Yeah.
Well, most of us who live in original town are in smaller homes, and we're living in that world, and that is, we know how to do that, and it's going to attract people who know how to do that. So yeah, you can go either way. Developers are coming in and building huge homes with big basements. Yes, they're getting sold, but that doesn't mean that we necessarily want our neighborhood to be that way, right? It's the people who live there now generally live in smaller square footage.
Other thoughts? Yeah, I'll come back to you.
Is there a home or a structure in original town that is 32 feet that I could use as a benchmark example?
Maple Street.
It's all in Maple Street is 32 feet? Okay, great.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
It's over that, isn't it? Is Maple Street over that?
No, it's a 32.
Depends on the So the 30% lot coverage in a lot of communities that I'm aware of, the lot coverage also includes your walkways and your driveways, but that's not the case here. Is that correct?
Can you clarify that, Stephen?
It does not include your driveways or your walkways.
So that's just building structure.
Okay, so I was going to recommend that the 30% actually only be
the building
and not be your driveway and your other components.
Makes sense. Other questions, concerns? Okay, let's see where. Thoughts on this? So in which of the following areas would you support variations to incentivize desired development patterns in original town? So basically, where are we willing to consider potential trade-offs? Maximum.
More than one?
Nope.
Okay.
All possible.
I'm sorry, Bob, you actually can pick more than one in this one. I misspoke. So yeah, so you have all of the above, none of the above, but you can also pick individual ones.
And are we assuming that in the earlier slide where it showed that if you had a two-story building, you would require a little bit indent and not to be a big box? We're assuming that.
Correct, yeah. Anybody still thinking? Going once? Okay. All possible options should be explored. That's helpful. And, you know, I think, again, all of this has to kind of work together. You need to look at, you know, if we apply option A to option B, you know, how big of a house does that get us? You know, what does that mean in terms of overall lot coverage? That's all stuff that would need to be addressed. And so this is a case of how things work together. But this is helpful in terms of looking at options. All right, so the last section that we wanted to touch on is a little bit higher level, and I think this has nothing to do with the overlay district, but these are things that we heard from you that were important to consider in original town going forward. So these are things that we've categorized as potential programs or initiatives. You know, the town obviously has limited resources, limited staffing, but we wanted to kind of get these out there as things that we heard and get a sense of what your priorities are. So we heard interest in a tree conservation or a tree planting program. The tree canopy was something that was really important to the community. Other folks said, you know, we'd really like to see a community garden in original town. Maybe we can do that in combination with one of the parks that we have. You know, what are the opportunities there? The idea of having some sort of grant or loan program to encourage folks to rehabilitate some of the original homes. You know, that's another tool that could be looked at. That takes money. That one's a little harder to implement, but it's an option. And then, you know, definitely wanted to acknowledge that, you know, we heard pretty loud and clear the preference for maintaining the informal pedestrian walkways in the RL area. You know, I think when we were on our walk, I said the same thing to Planning Commission. I think the conversation that stuck out to me most was the woman who said, you know, I like that we walk in the middle of the street because a car comes down, you know, they stop to talk to us. It's part of the sense of community in original town, and so that was, you know, important. It doesn't mean we don't have to consider accessibility issues and those types of things, but there are certainly communities that have chosen to retain a more informal character like this specifically for that reason. And so it's not unheard of for someone to say, a community to say, you know, we don't want detached walks and, you know, kind of that doesn't fit our character. The other thing to mention, and this kind of fits into where we started, is that those connections to the marketplace are really important for the livability of this area as well. And so that's something that we are addressing through the marketplace discussions, but didn't want to lose sight of that here. So this is our last question, but just to kind of get a sense, this is a case where we want you to pick two. You know, what are the highest priority things? Knowing that the town has limited resources and limited staffing, you know, if, you know, at some point in the future the town were to say, you know, we've heard this is a priority, we're going to pursue this, what would you want them to start with? So the first one is the tree conservation, tree planting program. Second is community garden, the loan program, just adopting a formal policy about pedestrian walkways in the RL area, pedestrian connections, none of the above, or not sure.
You need to pick two?
Yes, please. Okay, going once. All right, so connections to the marketplace are pretty key. And then, interesting, the tree conservation and planting program is pretty high priority. 3 was the grant loan program. So, yeah, that's helpful. So basically, our intent in asking this question is just to be able to bring your feedback back to the town board. They have that documented in terms of future decisions related to those aspects of Original Town. All right. Yes?
I appreciate this question, and I understand having to pick and choose, but see that none of the above, I wanted the option of all of the above. Just want to say that.
Fair enough. And that's actually a deliberate omission for that reason.
You only have 2 things.
So
Just want to get it out there.
Yep. Yeah, no, we know they're all important, but we did want to have some sense of priorities, so. Okay. All right, so in terms of next steps, I mentioned earlier, we have a meeting scheduled on November 13th to dig into the marketplace. Discussions, there's been a lot of, work done on that since many of you probably saw it last in May. So encourage you to participate if you're interested. That's going to be from 11 to 1. And then we will be meeting again with Planning Commission. We don't have a specific date yet to kind of wrap up everything we've heard from this meeting and the 13th, and then kind of get our recommendations together for the Planning Commission to take back to the town board. And that's probably going to be sometime in January, also date to be determined. But are there other questions or comments before we wrap up? Yeah.
So the grant loan program, I'm thinking that part of CAPS, which is the cultural arts, and perhaps the historic commission could combine. We're working on a master plan for the cultural arts community. And I know that Lafayette did a similar program where they, people applied and it was like $1,000 to do curb appeal components kind of thing. So it doesn't have to be super expensive.
Yeah.
And I'd like to keep that in mind in terms of maybe being some of our communities working together.
That's a great suggestion. Thank you.
Anthony suggested maybe we ask people if they want to leave a note, write something for us.
Absolutely.
To review later,
Absolutely.
How we can facilitate that.
We put some notepads and pens out here, so if anybody has questions or comments or anything that they didn't want to share in front of everyone, you're welcome to leave those.
Review them all and talk about it.
And we're happy to, we're happy to stick around if you just want to grab one of us too and answer any questions offline if you have them. So any others while we have the group together? Yeah.
I just want to say thank you. I feel like this is really amazing and I've been to, I think this is my 3rd one of these now, and I'm really impressed with how thoughtful these plans are and how much you're listening, so I really appreciate that.
Thank you. Thank you guys for sticking with us and continuing to come, because I think that's the only way we're going to really get a handle on where you want to go. So we really appreciate you all being here, and stay in tune, and we'll be back. So thank you very much.